You want relief. I understand. Relief is merciful. But mercy without meaning is morphine without rehabilitation. It numbs without teaching. I do not deny relief to anyone. I only caution that relief alone cannot carry a soul. The soul needs a horizon, a reason to rise, a vow made in the dark that daylight will not annul. So let us not ask only how to lessen pain. Let us also ask how to lift purpose. There are 3 paths through which meaning enters a life: through work, through love, and through the stance we take toward unavoidable suffering. Work is not just employment. It is contribution, the offering of your gifts to the common table. Love is not just romance. It is reverence, the act of seeing the irreplaceability of the other and acting accordingly. And suffering, the most reluctant teacher of all, asks of us the nobility to transform defeat into dignity. Work first. You may feel ordinary, but nothing is ordinary about being irreplaceable to at least one person, one task, one corner of the world you can clean, repair, enrich, or protect. Meaning through work does not require fame. It requires fidelity. Do the necessary work near you, and do it as if someone's well-being depends on it, because someone's well-being does. When you give your best to the small sphere you inhabit, you are not thinking small. You are planting a forest that begins with a single tree. Remember, no one can give your exact gift. If you refuse to bring it, the world will lack it. That is how crucial you are. Then love. People will leave. People will disappoint. People will astonish with kindness. Love is the decision to treat another as a universe and not a utility. When you love, you step into a mystery. You become responsible for a part of the world that has a name and a heart. And when you suffer, love teaches you that you do not suffer alone. Shared pain does not double, it divides. Shared joy does not divide, it multiplies. Love reveals the mathematics of meaning. And then suffering. You will not always be able to remove it, but you can remove its poison. The poison is not pain itself. The poison is hopelessness, the belief that pain has nothing to teach and that you have nothing to offer while in it. This belief is a thief. It steals the gold hidden in the ash. I ask you to become an alchemist. No, not of metals, but of moments. Transform what threatens to diminish you into what obliges you to grow. Do not romanticize suffering. Refine it. Do not worship it. Work with it. Let suffering be neither your master nor your enemy. Let it be your stern tutor. How? Begin by naming what you cannot control and distinguishing it from what you can. This is not a cliché. It is a skill. You cannot control the weather, a diagnosis, a betrayal, a random loss. You can control your honesty, your generosity, your patience, your willingness to continue. You can control the words you choose when you are disappointed. You can control whether you make someone else's day heavier or lighter. This is not small. This is sovereign. Life will hand you roles you would not have auditioned for. Play them with integrity anyway. You do not get to choose all the scripts. You do get to choose the character. Perhaps you believe you must first feel hope to act with meaning. Not so. Action can summon hope like a lighthouse calls a ship. When you act in alignment with your values, the fog inside you begins to thin. Do a faithful thing before you feel faithful. Courage arrives in the disguise of small duties well kept. Choose any corner of chaos near you and introduce a little order. The world will not be saved by one grand gesture. It will be mended by a million quiet ones. You may ask, what if I fail? I answer with affection. Failure is not the opposite of meaning. It is one of its instruments. Meaning does not require victory to be valid. A parent who loves a child through illness may not conquer the illness, but they have conquered something greater, the temptation to abandon love under pressure. That is triumph enough for a mortal life. Measure your victories by the virtues they protect, not only by the outcomes they achieve. I must tell you a story woven from thousands. Someone walks through the ruins of what used to be their certainty. They are tempted by bitterness, by the cold thrill of declaring all things futile, but they refuse. They pick up one brick of responsibility and place it where it might help. They make tea for a neighbor. They write a note to a nurse. They finish an assignment without applause. They show up to a promise no one would blame them for breaking. In these small, quiet acts, they rediscover their dignity, and dignity, once rediscovered, radiates. It changes the posture with which you meet the world. It makes you unshakable, not because nothing can break you, but because even when you break, you do not scatter. There is a freedom only those who have suffered know. The freedom from illusions about what matters. That freedom tastes like gratitude. Gratitude is not the denial of pain. It is the defiance of despair. It says, even now there is something left to give thanks for, and I will give it. Even now there is someone left to bless, and I will bless them. Gratitude is the hand that turns off the faucet of self-pity. It allows you to drink from a different well. The air in the morning had the weight of history pressing down on it. I did not yet understand fully what it meant to be stripped of all pretense, all habitual control, all social masks, but the gates of the camp made this truth impossible to ignore. Every step I took on the gravel was a negotiation with the gravity of existence itself. Here, suffering was no abstraction, no philosophical exercise. It was immediate, palpable, and unyielding. My body was a ledger of exhaustion, my mind a fragile cathedral of fleeting memories, and my spirit, what remained, was tested relentlessly. In those early days, I noticed how swiftly the human mind learns to economize. The small things became enormous treasures. A piece of bread, a few drops of water, the brief warmth of the sun on the skin, the glance of a fellow prisoner whose eyes had not yet gone entirely hollow. Each of these moments was a currency that bought the ability to endure another hour, another day. We were forced to learn that meaning could be distilled into gestures, attention, and fleeting acts of compassion. The very concept of freedom was now measured in micro-moments. The choice to retain one's dignity, to choose thought over despair, to refuse hatred despite being surrounded by the machinery of cruelty. I recall a single morning when the sky was a pale gray smear, and the barracks echoed with coughing and despair. I was assigned to the labor detail, and the thought that each day could be my last was ever present. I realized that suffering itself could become a teacher, but only if I chose to engage with it deliberately. I could surrender to the brutal rhythm imposed upon me, allowing the mind to harden into fear and resentment. Or I could assert a small domain of freedom, the domain of choice within myself. Even here, stripped of almost everything, I retained one thing: how I responded. And in that response lay a kernel of liberty, a stubborn inner autonomy that the guards could not take. There were moments when I observed my fellow prisoners with a kind of detached empathy. Each person bore a unique story, a universe of past joys and future hopes compressed into the cage of present suffering. In the way one man adjusted his thin blanket to cover a child's shivering legs, in the quiet nod between two strangers who shared a crust of bread, I saw evidence that the human spirit, though bent, could endure without entirely breaking. The smallest acts, holding someone's gaze, offering a word, sharing a morsel, became moral statements, declarations that suffering did not absolve one from humanity. Hunger, fatigue, cold, and fear became teachers in an unexpected way. They revealed the anatomy of the self, how much is borrowed from circumstance, how much is permanent, and how much resides in the inner fortress of thought and imagination. I learned to retreat into the inner life, to fashion a sanctuary of memory, of hope, of mental freedom, even as the outer world sought to crush it. The mind became a secret temple, a place where I could rehearse freedom, even if the body was enslaved. One night, after the roll call, I sat on the bare floor and allowed my thoughts to wander to my life before the camp. Faces of loved ones, fragments of conversation, images of familiar landscapes. These became a library of meaning. I realized that memory could serve as sustenance. When the body is starved, the mind can feast on recollections, deliberate imaginings, and the reconstruction of values. In this way, I discovered that inner freedom is cultivated not by avoiding suffering, but by confronting it with awareness and purpose. The human capacity to find meaning in suffering was made manifest in the small choices we could still make. A prisoner might choose to endure labor with dignity rather than resentful collapse. Another might choose to support a fellow inmate, even at the cost of personal comfort or risk. These were decisions of the soul, imperceptible to the oppressors, yet monumental in preserving identity. I realized then that the ultimate freedom is never taken from us. It is claimed, moment by moment, in the way we respond to conditions beyond our control. I recall an episode during work details in the freezing morning, when a fellow prisoner, shivering uncontrollably, was at risk of collapse. The guards would have turned away, seeing only weakness, but we could act. I offered my coat, a gesture so minimal, almost absurd, against the magnitude of suffering, yet it was enough to affirm our shared humanity. These small moral acts became a lattice upon which hope could cling, a demonstration that, while suffering imposes limits, it cannot fully dictate moral action. The camps also taught the harsh lesson of impermanence. Friends disappeared without warning. One day, a familiar face would be there. The next day, only a vacant space. This constant flux forced an intense awareness of the present. Attachments, once taken for granted, had to be held lightly, loved deliberately, and appreciated fully while they existed. The mind, in response, learned to inhabit each moment with precision, to recognize that value is found not in permanence, but in attentive presence. Even in despair, I found that humor, memory, and imagination could serve as lifeline. I would recall poems, passages from books, philosophical reflections, and reconstruct entire worlds in my mind. These exercises were not escapes. They were methods of asserting that life, even in extremity, retains possibility. They trained me to cultivate freedom in thought, a mental autonomy that no barbed wire could fence. The brutal environment also revealed the necessity of psychological triage. With limited energy and constant threat, one had to decide where to invest mental resources. Obsessing over injustice, wishing for reprieve that might never come, or allowing anger to dominate thoughts, was a form of self-poisoning. Instead, I learned to allocate attention strategically. I would hold some moments for despair, others for gratitude, others for planning and small moral actions. This conscious allocation of psychic energy became a daily survival tool, a method of reclaiming agency. There were rituals that I devised in secret, fragments of routines that could not be observed, but which preserved coherence. I would recite a passage mentally, observe the rhythm of my breathing, or silently narrate a future scenario of freedom and meaningful work. These inner practices became lifelines, subtle rebellions that affirmed the integrity of the soul. They reminded me that while the outer world imposed cruelty, the inner world remained sovereign, if one chose to cultivate it. The question of meaning became urgent in a way I had never known. Here, stripped of status, property, and social conventions, the essential question arose. Why continue? Why endure? And what is the purpose of each small breath in a place designed to annihilate? The answer, discovered in fragments and through observation, was that suffering without meaning is torment, but suffering embraced as a medium for moral and spiritual action becomes a passage to freedom. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Freedom is inseparable from responsibility, even in the most oppressive circumstances. I observed others who had given up entirely. Their bodies survived, but their souls had contracted. They counted hours, raged silently, or numbed themselves to all feeling. They were alive in flesh, yet a subtle death had crept into their eyes, posture, and responses. Contrastingly, those who retained inner purpose, those who chose daily small acts of moral courage, were buoyed by a resilience imperceptible to the guards, yet powerful in sustaining life. Meaning, not circumstance, became the decisive factor between mere survival and living with human dignity. Each day in the camp was a calculus of endurance. But endurance without reflection was merely a reflex of the body. The mind, guided by awareness, transformed endurance into action, observation into learning, and suffering into insight. I discovered that even in extreme degradation, one could cultivate qualities invisible to the oppressors: honesty, compassion, courage, and disciplined attention. These qualities were a form of inner sovereignty, a fortress within which freedom could persist, however modestly, against overwhelming odds. There were mornings when the sky itself seemed to conspire against us, a slate-gray expanse that pressed down with the weight of inevitability. I would rise from the straw-covered floor, joints stiff, muscles screaming, lungs tasting frost, and yet I learned to observe the rhythm of the camp with a meticulous attention that became a survival tool. Every sound, the roll call bells, the distant bark of a guard, the shuffle of feet, was a signal. Each signal demanded assessment. Who among the prisoners would falter today? Who would endure and who might act with generosity, however perilously, in that moment. The capacity to read these signs became as essential as the ability to walk or to eat. Hunger sharpened perception in ways I had never known. When food was scarce and rationed to meager crumbs, I discovered that the mind could find sustenance in memory and imagination. I would close my eyes and recall meals from years before, the taste of bread baked at dawn, the aroma of coffee, the feel of a knife cutting into ripe fruit. This exercise was not indulgence. It was an act of claiming dignity, a rebellion against the annihilation of experience. I learned to feed my spirit when my body was starved, and in doing so, I discovered that nourishment exists beyond the material. The bonds formed in the camp were paradoxical, fragile, yet indestructible in their intensity. One could not trust easily, for betrayal was often a matter of survival. Yet, fleeting alliances were forged in shared labor, in passing a hidden morsel, in offering a hand to a stumbling companion. I noticed that when one gave without expectation of return, even the smallest gesture carried a weight that outlasted the hunger of the moment. Compassion, when exercised under constraint, became a kind of moral currency, exchanged silently and stored invisibly within the soul. Sleep was a rare commodity, yet even in exhaustion, the mind refused to remain idle. I discovered techniques of mental rehearsal, imagining a lecture I would give, the structure of a book I intended to write, or the expression of gratitude I would convey once freedom returned. These rehearsals were acts of resistance, preserving intellectual and moral faculties, while the body was reduced to near mechanical function. Freedom, I realized, was not a physical state but a mental and moral achievement, claimed moment by moment through deliberate thought and attention. The brutality of the guards and the arbitrariness of punishment forced a profound interrogation of my assumptions about justice. I learned that justice could not always be external. It had to be internalized. I could not control their decisions, but I could control my response. When struck by indignity, I would rehearse in my mind the possibility of maintaining serenity, of refusing hatred, of seeing the humanity even in those who inflicted suffering. This exercise did not diminish the violence. It preserved the self. Freedom, as I came to understand it, was the ability to choose the moral quality of one's own response, even when every external condition conspired against it. There were moments when despair threatened to overwhelm, when the relentless calculus of survival seemed too great. In those moments, I would recall fragments of philosophy, poetry, and personal memory. Each fragment was a seed planted in the barren soil of the camp, a reminder that the mind and soul could inhabit a domain untouched by a barbed wire. I discovered that hope is not a naive optimism, but a deliberate orientation of consciousness toward possibility, however improbable it may appear. Humor became another tool of resilience, subtle and covert. A whispered joke, a shared grim observation, a wry smile exchanged under the watchful eyes of guards, all served to reclaim a fragment of humanity. Humor did not deny suffering. It acknowledged it and allowed the spirit to assert presence within it. In a place designed to erase identity, even the smallest act of levity was an assertion of self. I also learned the importance of ritual in sustaining sanity. A brief, repeated gesture, a touch to a hidden book, a whispered prayer, a personal vow, became a scaffold upon which the mind could cling. These rituals were not performative. They were deliberate acts of internal governance, small citadels of order amidst chaos. They allowed me to create continuity of self, a thread linking the man I was before imprisonment with the man I intended to become after. Observation of the human body under extreme stress revealed lessons about endurance, adaptation, and dignity. Some prisoners collapsed under the weight of hunger and fear, their spirits succumbing to the mind's insistence on futility. Others preserved themselves through the careful rationing of effort, the meticulous conservation of energy, and the strategic deployment of attention. Survival required a balance of physical prudence and moral vigilance. One could not merely endure. One had to act with deliberation, preserve dignity, and cultivate an inner autonomy that defied the external machinery of oppression. Small acts of kindness became epic gestures in context. Sharing a piece of bread, offering warmth to a trembling companion, or whispering encouragement in the dead of night were interventions that rippled beyond the immediate moment. They demonstrated that the moral life is never extinguished entirely by external cruelty. It can be cultivated quietly, invisibly, with profound consequences for both giver and receiver. I observed that hope is often invisible to the untrained eye, yet it manifests in posture, gaze, and the meticulous preservation of ritual and memory. A prisoner who maintains the cadence of their own values, even in extremity, carries within them a freedom that cannot be stolen. I discovered that the capacity for hope, moral action, and intellectual engagement is the true measure of liberation. It is less a function of circumstance than of deliberate choice. In reflection, the camps taught me a singular truth. Suffering and freedom are inseparable. Only when confronted with the deepest deprivation, when all external supports are stripped away, does the soul's capacity for moral and existential choice reveal itself fully. Freedom is not the absence of suffering, but the ability to navigate it with intentionality, dignity, and purpose. The human spirit, when exercised even under the most extreme constraints, possesses a resilience that outlives tyranny, cruelty, and death. There were days when the cold was a living entity, gnawing at flesh and bone. Yet even then, the mind could assert sovereignty. I would notice the rhythm of my breathing, the beat of my heart, the way my feet struck the frozen ground, and I realized that awareness itself could become a bastion of freedom. The body could be starved, abused, and weakened, but consciousness retained a domain that no external force could seize entirely. Every deliberate thought, every chosen perception, became a small act of rebellion, a reclaiming of the self. In those hours of toil, when labor demanded more than the body could give, I discovered the necessity of mental detachment, not avoidance, not denial, but the deliberate redirection of thought to internal landscapes untouched by the brutality around me. I would rehearse lectures I would someday give, compose essays in the quiet spaces of my mind, and imagine acts of kindness and justice I could perform in the future. This mental rehearsal was not mere escapism. It was preparation, a cultivation of inner territory immune to oppression. Observation became a survival strategy. I learned to read subtle cues among fellow prisoners, a twitch of the eye signaling impending danger, a shift in posture revealing weakness or deceit, the smallest gestures of solidarity or desperation. These observations were not abstract. They informed real-time decisions about whom to trust, when to act, and how to conserve energy. In the presence of constant threat, the capacity to see clearly, both morally and practically, was indispensable. Hunger and exhaustion revealed the fragility and resilience of the human psyche. I noted how individuals coped differently. Some succumbed entirely, allowing despair to dominate thought. Others marshaled whatever inner resources they could, finding meaning in the smallest acts, the briefest exchanges, the unnoticed victories. I realized that meaning is not a luxury. It is a necessity. It transforms mere survival into a life lived with dignity, even under conditions designed to annihilate spirit. There were profound lessons in the moments of loss, when friends, once vibrant and animated, disappeared into the machinery of the camp. Each disappearance was a reminder of impermanence, compelling an acute awareness of the present. Attachment became both more painful and more precious. I learned to inhabit each moment fully, to recognize value in fleeting encounters, and to cultivate gratitude for the smallest gestures of connection. Even in the shadow of death, there were opportunities for human expression, for the assertion of love and dignity. Small acts of defiance carried monumental weight, sharing a morsel of food, offering warmth to a shivering companion, whispering encouragement, or even a fleeting smile. All these were moral victories. The oppressors could control bodies, ration sustenance, and impose labor, but they could not dictate the moral choices we made in the quiet spaces between orders. Every ethical decision became a declaration of inner freedom, a testimony to the irreducible dignity of the soul. I came to see that suffering is a lens through which the human capacity for meaning is revealed. In the absence of external freedoms, the internal domain becomes the arena of true liberty. One can be physically confined and morally constrained, yet retain a sovereignty of conscience. Every choice, no matter how small, How one speaks to a fellow prisoner, how one endures a strike, how one attends to thought, becomes a claim of ownership over one's spirit. Memory emerged as both refuge and weapon. I would recall landscapes of childhood, the sound of rivers, the faces of loved ones, and the textures of ordinary life before incarceration. These recollections were not merely sentimental. They were sustenance. They preserved identity and continuity, allowing the self to remain intact amid relentless external deprivation. Imagination, too, became a tool of freedom, enabling me to rehearse future acts of justice, kindness, and scholarship. Observation of moral collapse was as instructive as the practice of virtue. I noted prisoners who surrendered to bitterness, envy, or despair. Their suffering intensified, not from external conditions alone, but from the internal surrender to hopelessness. Conversely, those who preserved integrity, however tenuously, exhibited resilience. Meaning cultivated and claimed was the decisive factor in survival, not merely life preserved in the flesh, but life preserved in spirit and conscience. In quiet moments, I reflected on the paradoxical intimacy of extreme suffering. Stripped of societal roles, wealth, and convention, individuals were revealed in stark clarity. The mask of civility fell away, exposing raw tendencies toward cruelty, kindness, courage, or cowardice. It became evident that external conditions do not fully define a human being. Choices, attention, and moral commitment shape the soul even when the body is enslaved. Even under the most crushing circumstances, laughter and humor emerged as survival mechanisms. Shared quietly, they affirmed life, maintained social bonds, and provided relief from relentless tension. Humor did not negate suffering. It reframed it, offering perspective and reinforcing the continuity of self. In this light, the human capacity for joy, even faint and fleeting, becomes a profound assertion of freedom. Ritual, repeated and discreet, provided coherence amid chaos. Mental prayers, silent vows, and carefully rehearsed sequences of thought created stability. These internal ceremonies were invisible to others, yet they preserved identity, sanity, and moral agency. The repetition of small, meaningful acts transformed mere survival into a practice of ethical and spiritual endurance. I observed that hope is a discipline, not a passive state. It requires deliberate attention, cultivation, and protection against the encroachment of despair. Hope manifests in small decisions: a choice to act morally, a refusal to succumb to bitterness, a commitment to remember and imagine a life beyond the immediate cruelty. It is both fragile and powerful, requiring daily maintenance and conscious investment. The camps, in their relentless dehumanization, exposed the essence of freedom. It is not freedom of circumstance which can be stolen, but freedom of response. Even when stripped of possessions, social status, and autonomy of movement, one retains the capacity to choose one's attitude, one's attention, and one's moral action. This freedom is inseparable from responsibility. The responsibility to act with integrity, to preserve dignity, and to cultivate meaning amid adversity. Finally, I discovered that suffering, though imposed externally, can become a medium for growth. Endurance is transformed into insight when accompanied by reflection, observation, and moral engagement. Every challenge, every indignity, every moment of despair carries the potential to reveal strength, compassion, and purpose. The human spirit, exercised deliberately even under extreme constraint, demonstrates an irreducible capacity for freedom that transcends the limitations of circumstance. The days blurred into one another, a monotonous rhythm of labor, deprivation, and roll calls. Yet within that relentless sameness, I learned to find the infinitesimal fissures where freedom could emerge. Even the act of observing another human being without judgment became a practice of sovereignty. I would watch a man tremble under the cold, note the small gestures that preserved his dignity. A careful folding of his coat, a hesitant offering of bread to another. And I recognized that the moral universe persisted, subtle and imperceptible. Despite the machinery of oppression, there were moments when fear seemed insurmountable. The sight of a prisoner collapsing under work, the sudden disappearance of a friend, the arbitrary cruelty of the guards, all these could consume thought entirely. Yet I discovered a paradox. When one's attention was turned deliberately toward small moral acts, Even in the shadow of immense suffering, the spirit retained its capacity to act freely, offering warmth, a whispered word of encouragement, or simply sustaining one's posture with dignity became acts of liberation. They required conscious effort, and they yielded a subtle, sustaining power that hunger and cruelty could not annihilate. One morning, as the frost clung to the barracks and the wind cut through thin clothing, I observed a young man shivering beside me. His eyes were hollow, yet he refused to ask for help. I hesitated, then offered a piece of bread, the only morsel I had saved. His hand trembled as he accepted it, and in that moment, I understood the immensity of small kindness. The world outside the camp might never recognize this act, yet within the microcosm of our suffering, it had the weight of eternity. Compassion, exercised even when unnoticed, is a claim to freedom. Memory and imagination became lifelines. At night, when the barracks were silent except for coughing and occasional whispers, I would reconstruct conversations, imagine future lectures, and replay moments of ethical clarity from my past. These mental exercises were acts of defiance, creating inner landscapes untouched by oppression. I realized that the mind can inhabit spaces of liberty even when the body is confined. Freedom, I understood more clearly than ever, is not the absence of constraint, but the ability to choose one's response. Interactions with fellow prisoners revealed the extraordinary variability of human resilience. Some surrendered entirely to despair, allowing bitterness and fear to dominate thought. Others cultivated inner discipline, preserving rituals of dignity, subtle humor, and acts of service. These differences illuminated a profound truth. External circumstances shape the body, but the soul's response, its attention, moral choices, and cultivation of meaning, remains sovereign. One can be imprisoned in flesh yet free in conscience. The guards themselves, embodiments of arbitrary authority, became unwitting teachers. Their cruelty revealed the limits of physical power and the boundless potential of the human spirit to claim inner autonomy. Observing their behavior, I learned to differentiate between what could be controlled and what could not. Resistance in its most potent form is often invisible. A refusal to hate, a disciplined attention to thought, a maintenance of dignity despite humiliation. These acts require no weapons, yet they confer a freedom the oppressor cannot touch. Even in labor, the body became a conduit for moral choice. Tasks imposed by the camp were designed to exhaust and dehumanize, yet within these routines, one could assert small domains of agency, maintaining posture, offering silent assistance, choosing deliberate precision in action. These were ethical gestures, proof that one's spirit remained intact. The tyranny of circumstance cannot nullify the conscious exercise of moral judgment, even under the harshest conditions. Hunger sharpened perception and clarified priorities. I observed how prisoners allocated energy, attention, and care. Those who survived most effectively were not merely physically strong. They had cultivated the inner capacity to choose where to invest effort and how to maintain coherence of self. The mind's ability to prioritize moral and practical action, even amidst deprivation, became as essential as any rationed bread or coat. Survival depended on the combination of prudence, observation, and ethical engagement. Friendship and solidarity were forged in extreme conditions. Trust was fragile, yet moments of shared risk created bonds that transcended fear. A whispered strategy, a covert exchange of food, or a mutual support during labor were more than survival tactics. They were affirmations of human dignity. These alliances, however ephemeral, demonstrated that even in the depths of suffering, ethical relationships could persist, sustaining hope and preserving identity. I noted how despair could metastasize if left unattended. Prisoners who allowed bitterness, envy, or hopelessness to dominate often succumbed more quickly to illness and mental collapse. Conversely, those who cultivated inner practices of meaning, memory, reflection, ritual, and small moral acts exhibited resilience. The moral life, exercised even under constraint, becomes the most potent source of enduring freedom. This insight reshaped my understanding. Suffering does not inherently crush. It reveals the capacity of the human spirit when approached deliberately. There were nights of terror, when dreams of the outside world clashed with the reality of imprisonment. Yet even in these moments, I discovered that imagination could be wielded as a tool of liberation. I would rehearse future lectures, construct mental essays, or visualize acts of justice and kindness. These exercises preserved continuity of self and affirmed the irreducibility of moral and intellectual agency. Freedom, I learned, is inseparable from the deliberate cultivation of thought, reflection, and attention. Observation of ethical collapse was instructive. Some prisoners, reacting to injustice with hatred or vengeance, allowed their inner life to be consumed. Others, though subjected to the same brutality, maintained deliberate practices of kindness, attention, and integrity. The difference lay not in circumstance, but in conscious engagement with suffering. Moral choice, exercised persistently, transforms even the harshest environment into a field of ethical labor. Humor, carefully deployed, became a subtle assertion of life. Shared smiles, whispered jokes, or ironic observations created a buffer against despair. Humor did not deny suffering. It reframed it and reinforced the continuity of identity. Even in extremity, the human capacity for joy, levity, and moral reflection remains a potent assertion of freedom. Finally, I recognize that the purpose of suffering is revealed through deliberate response. It is not endurance alone that grants insight, but the cultivation of moral, intellectual, and spiritual capacities in the face of relentless deprivation. Each act of attention, each gesture of kindness, each disciplined thought becomes a claim to freedom. The soul, exercised intentionally, remains sovereign, capable of resilience, compassion, and insight. Even amid overwhelming cruelty, meaning persists and freedom endures. There were days when exhaustion became a companion, its weight pressing not only upon the body, but upon the mind itself. Yet in this exhaustion, I discovered a peculiar clarity. When the ordinary distractions of life are stripped away, one sees the human condition in its starkest form: vulnerability, mortality, and the fundamental questions of existence. The body can falter, but the mind, when deliberately engaged, retains sovereignty. Each thought, each conscious choice, becomes a tiny assertion of freedom, a reclamation of self from the machinery of oppression. I learned to observe the rhythm of the camp as one might study a natural ecosystem. The guards, the routines, the random dispersals of punishment, the faintest cues of impending danger, all formed patterns. Awareness of these patterns was not mere survival strategy. It became a practice of attention, a cultivation of presence. The mind that notices, that discerns, that evaluates without succumbing to despair, retains a measure of freedom no cage can take. Friendship, when it appeared, was a fragile yet profound form of resistance. Bonds forged in shared labor, whispered encouragement, or the quiet sharing of a morsel of bread were acts of defiance. They preserved humanity in a place designed to erase it. Even the smallest gestures, a hand extended to steady a companion, a smile exchanged beneath the shadow of despair, were declarations of moral sovereignty. In these interactions, I observed the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Memory became a lifeline. I would close my eyes and reconstruct scenes of a world that no longer existed. Streets of my youth, conversations with family and friends, moments of beauty and laughter. These recollections were not escapism. They were sustenance. They preserved identity and moral continuity, reminding me that although my body was confined, my soul could traverse vast landscapes. Imagination, exercised deliberately, became a domain of freedom, a sanctuary untouched by external tyranny. Observation of the human body under extreme stress yielded profound lessons. I noted the differences between those who collapsed under the weight of hunger, fear, and despair, and those who maintained coherence of action, posture, and attention. Survival depended not solely on physical strength, but on the disciplined cultivation of thought, the careful management of attention, and the conscious exercise of moral choice. The human spirit, when deliberately nurtured, can assert autonomy even under unimaginable constraints. I also discovered the necessity of inner ritual, simple, repeated actions, mental prayers, affirmations of moral intention, silent rehearsals of future lectures or writings, provided coherence. These rituals, invisible to observers, created continuity of self and preserved integrity. Even in a world designed to obliterate identity, The deliberate cultivation of inner practices maintained a form of freedom. Discipline of mind and spirit became as essential as warmth, food, or sleep. Hunger, though brutal, clarified priorities. I observed how prisoners allocated scarce resources of energy, attention, and moral effort. Those who survived most effectively did not merely conserve physical energy. They prioritized ethical action, strategic observation, and maintenance of inner integrity. Survival was as much a moral exercise as a physical one. The conscious management of attention, the choice to act ethically despite circumstance, and the cultivation of meaning distinguished the resilient from the despairing. Humor, even when faint and hidden, emerged as a subtle rebellion. A whispered joke, an ironic remark, a shared smile, all asserted presence and preserved identity. Humor did not erase suffering. It reframed it, offering perspective and maintaining continuity of self. In these moments, I recognized the capacity of the human spirit to transcend even the most dehumanizing conditions. I observed that suffering forces the question of meaning into the foreground. Stripped of external structures, one is confronted with the essential choice: how to respond. Some surrendered entirely to despair, allowing bitterness, envy, or rage to dominate thought. Others cultivated small, deliberate practices of attention, moral action, and reflection. These practices, often invisible to all but the self, preserved freedom. Meaning, deliberately engaged, becomes a lifeline. Freedom, inseparable from moral choice, persists even in extremity. Interactions with guards, when unavoidable, became exercises in discernment. I learned to differentiate between threats that demanded immediate compliance and moments where one could preserve dignity. Resistance was often invisible, maintaining composure, refusing hatred, choosing deliberate thought over reactive emotion. These small, deliberate acts of autonomy became a form of inner sovereignty. Even under arbitrary cruelty, the capacity to choose one's response remained inviolate. I discovered that attention itself is a scarce and precious resource. One cannot afford to squander it on endless rumination over injustice or imagined reprieve. Instead, one must allocate mental energy deliberately, attending to survival, moral action, memory, and imagination. Conscious allocation of attention is a subtle exercise of freedom, a way of cultivating order and meaning in a world designed to enforce chaos. There were nights when dreams and memory intermingled, when the mind traveled far beyond the camp walls. I would rehearse acts of kindness, reconstruct ethical choices, or visualize lectures I would someday deliver. These exercises reinforced continuity of self and moral agency. Freedom, I understood, is inseparable from the cultivation of thought and conscience. Even under physical bondage, the deliberate exercise of imagination and attention preserves autonomy. Observation of moral collapse and resilience provided profound insight. Those who surrendered to despair or hatred often fell quickly to illness and exhaustion. Those who cultivated inner discipline, attention, and ethical practice endured. Meaning, deliberately claimed, becomes the decisive factor between spiritual death and the preservation of dignity. Even the smallest ethical gesture, a shared crumb, a whispered encouragement, maintaining composure under insult, becomes an affirmation of freedom. Memory, imagination, humor, and deliberate attention formed a constellation of inner practices that preserved integrity. These were not abstract exercises, they were survival tools. They reinforced the notion that the human spirit, when deliberately cultivated, remains sovereign. Even in the depths of suffering, one retains the capacity for moral judgment, imagination, and the exercise of attention. The monotony of the camp, broken only by the extremes of hunger, labor, and the arbitrary cruelties of the guards, revealed an unexpected clarity about the human condition. Stripped of social roles, possessions, and external markers of identity, individuals were revealed in their essence. Some surrendered to despair, while others preserved small domains of dignity. Observation became a crucial skill, noting who faltered under fear, who maintained composure, who offered a gesture of kindness despite risk. Each observation was an investment in moral and practical survival. There were subtle strategies that prisoners developed, often unconsciously, to maintain coherence of self. Repetitive mental exercises, rehearsing past conversations, reciting poetry, imagining acts of justice, became methods of psychological preservation. These exercises were not mere escape. They were deliberate cultivation of inner freedom, a practice of sovereignty over thought and attention. Even in the harshest conditions, the mind could claim autonomy if only one disciplined it with purpose. Hunger, the most persistent companion, sharpened perception and clarified priorities. One learned to ration not only food but mental energy. To waste attention on imagined grievances or resentment was a form of self-poisoning. Instead, conscious effort was directed toward ethical observation, strategic action, and preservation of dignity. Survival became as much a moral and cognitive exercise as a physical one. Freedom was enacted in choices: how to respond to cruelty, how to allocate energy, and how to preserve moral integrity. Friendship, though fragile and precarious, became a source of sustenance. Shared glances, whispered encouragements, or covert exchanges of food reinforced the continuity of humanity. Even fleeting alliances held immense weight. They reminded us that moral and emotional life persists even under the most oppressive conditions. The practice of loyalty and compassion, exercised discreetly, became a subtle rebellion against the erasure of identity. The psychological tactics we developed were intricate. Attention had to be managed carefully. Despair could consume mental resources if left unattended. Imagination became a tool for liberation, reconstructing meaningful experiences from the past, visualizing acts of ethical significance in the future, and rehearsing small gestures of kindness in the present. These internal exercises preserved moral agency and continuity of self. Interactions with guards demanded acute discernment. One could rarely control the external threat, but one could control response. Maintaining composure, choosing not to react with hatred, and exercising patience were all acts of freedom. Each decision, however subtle, was a claim to moral and psychological autonomy. Even under extreme oppression, one could assert control over thought, attention, and ethical action. Memory was a lifeline. I would mentally revisit moments of beauty, friendship, and intellectual engagement from a world outside the camp. These recollections preserved continuity of identity, allowing the mind to inhabit spaces of freedom. Imagination expanded these spaces, enabling rehearsal of future ethical actions, reflection, and subtle acts of rebellion against the annihilation of spirit. Freedom resided in these practices, accessible even when the body was entirely constrained. I observed that suffering clarifies what is essential. Superfluous concerns of status, wealth, or social recognition vanished. What remained was the capacity for moral action, attention, reflection, and memory. These became the criteria for spiritual survival. Those who cultivated these faculties endured with dignity. Those who neglected them often succumbed to despair, even if their bodies remained alive. Humor, quietly shared, became a balm. Even a fleeting smile or whispered joke preserved the continuity of self and affirmed presence. Humor did not negate the brutality of reality. It reframed it, creating a domain of subtle freedom. It reinforced bonds among prisoners, and reminded us that, despite dehumanizing conditions, the human spirit could assert itself through observation, creativity, and moral action. Ritual and repetition provided coherence. Mental prayers, affirmations of ethical intention, and rehearsed sequences of thought maintained identity amid chaos. These internal ceremonies, though invisible to others, fortified the self. They became scaffolds upon which consciousness could remain intact, asserting freedom over the body's suffering. Each deliberate mental act preserved a fragment of sovereignty, sustaining life beyond mere physical survival. Observation of ethical collapse was instructive. Despair, envy, and hatred consumed those who surrendered to them, while deliberate cultivation of attention, imagination, and moral action reinforced resilience. Meaning, consciously claimed, became the decisive factor in spiritual survival. Even minimal acts, sharing bread, whispering encouragement, maintaining composure, were monumental in affirming freedom and moral integrity. In quiet moments, I reflected on the paradoxical intimacy imposed by suffering. Stripped of everything extraneous, we were exposed in our essential nature. Some revealed courage, generosity, and steadfastness. Others revealed weakness, cruelty, or resignation. Circumstance could not fully define the human spirit. Conscious moral choice, attention, and reflection determined the preservation of dignity. There were moments when the monotony and brutality of the camp seemed unbearable. Yet even in those moments, I discovered subtle domains of freedom. The human mind, when disciplined, can create vast inner landscapes, impervious to physical constraints. I would visualize serene scenes from my past, imagine lectures I might someday deliver, and mentally construct essays on human dignity and meaning. These exercises were not mere fantasy. They were acts of sovereignty, deliberate cultivation of inner autonomy. Even as the body suffered, the mind remained free to choose its focus, its judgments, and its moral engagements. Observation became a form of mastery. I learned to read subtle signals among prisoners, a shift in posture, a twitch of the eye, the hesitation of a hand reaching for a morsel. These micro-moments revealed character, tensions, and resilience. Awareness of these cues was not simply tactical. It became a moral exercise. One learned to differentiate between acts of self-preservation that aligned with dignity and those that compromised it. Survival was inseparable from ethical judgment, and freedom was exercised in the space between stimulus and response. Friendship and solidarity, though rare and fragile, emerged as essential sources of strength. Sharing a hidden piece of bread, offering warmth to a trembling companion, or whispering encouragement carried immense significance. These gestures, however small, affirmed that moral life persists even under extreme adversity. They were proof that the human spirit could assert itself and preserve dignity, regardless of the external machinery of oppression. Hunger and exhaustion demanded strategies of psychological conservation. I observed that the prisoners who survived most effectively were not always the strongest physically, but those who managed attention, prioritized ethical action, and preserved rituals of dignity. Mental discipline became as crucial as any physical strategy. Freedom was enacted through deliberate focus, choosing what to think about, how to respond morally, and which small acts of resistance to execute. Memory and imagination became indispensable tools of survival. I would reconstruct vivid scenes from a world outside the camp, streets, conversations, meals, and landscapes. These recollections were not indulgent. They preserved identity and moral continuity. Imagination extended these spaces, enabling the rehearsal of ethical actions, the construction of moral arguments, and the envisioning of a future in which justice and dignity prevailed. Inner freedom was cultivated in these invisible mental landscapes. I noted the subtle ways in which suffering revealed character. Some prisoners allowed bitterness and hatred to dominate, amplifying their despair. Others cultivated compassion, humor, and deliberate attention, thereby preserving integrity. Moral choice, exercised consistently, became the differentiating factor between spiritual survival and spiritual collapse. Every ethical gesture, no matter how minor, sharing, encouraging, maintaining composure, became an assertion of freedom and humanity. Interaction with guards, though often dangerous, became a study in strategic moral practice. Compliance, when necessary, was executed without internal surrender. I discovered that one could obey outwardly while maintaining inner autonomy. The body might be compelled, but the mind remained sovereign. Patience, composure, and deliberate thought were forms of resistance invisible to observers yet powerful in preserving dignity and freedom. Humor, though fleeting, emerged as a critical mechanism for preserving identity. A shared laugh, a whispered ironic comment, or even a private internal joke became lifelines of human expression. Humor did not erase suffering. It reframed it, creating small spaces in which the self could assert presence. These moments, though ephemeral, reinforced moral and psychological resilience. Ritual remained a foundation of endurance. Silent prayers, mental rehearsals, and disciplined reflection provided coherence amid chaos. These repeated, deliberate acts created continuity of self, asserting freedom over one's inner world, even as the body endured relentless suffering. Attention to these rituals became a deliberate exercise in moral and psychological autonomy. Observation of despair and collapse was instructive. Those who surrendered to hatred, envy, or hopelessness often fell quickly, while those who cultivated attention, imagination, and ethical action endured. Meaning deliberately constructed and defended became the decisive factor in survival. Even minimal acts of kindness or moral awareness, offering bread, maintaining composure, or sustaining a ritual, affirmed freedom, dignity, and moral integrity. In moments of reflection, I recognize the paradox of suffering. It exposes the essence of human nature. Stripped of pretense, social position, and material comfort, individuals are revealed in stark clarity. Some demonstrate courage, compassion, and ethical consistency. Others reveal fragility, cruelty, or surrender. External conditions do not fully define the human spirit. Conscious moral choice, attention, and reflection shape the soul even under extreme duress. Even under relentless deprivation, hope can be cultivated. Hope is not a naive expectation of improvement, but a deliberate orientation of consciousness toward possibility. It manifests in attention to ethical action, preservation of dignity, memory, imagination, and small acts of kindness. It is both fragile and powerful, requiring constant maintenance, yet it sustains life in its deepest sense, enabling spiritual endurance where material survival might be precarious. The camps taught me that freedom is inseparable from responsibility. Every deliberate thought, every ethical action, every act of observation and reflection was a claim to autonomy. Even when the body is enslaved, the soul can exercise sovereignty. The cultivation of attention, memory, imagination, and moral action constitutes a domain of freedom no external force can seize. The camp imposed a rhythm of existence that seemed designed to erode the self entirely. Yet in this imposed rhythm, I discovered the capacity for inner sovereignty. The body could be exhausted, starved, and beaten, but consciousness remained a domain no external power could fully seize. I learned to observe every detail. The slight hesitation of a guard's hand, the minute exchange of glances between prisoners, the subtle rhythms of labor and roll calls. Each observation became a tool for survival, a practice of moral and psychological vigilance. Even the smallest gestures carried enormous weight, sharing a fraction of bread, offering warmth to a trembling companion, or whispering encouragement were acts that transcended immediate utility. They were claims to humanity in a world intent on annihilation. I learned that the moral universe persists, even when external structures of society have vanished. Every act of attention and ethical engagement, however subtle, affirmed freedom. Memory became both sanctuary and weapon. I would close my eyes and reconstruct moments of joy, conversation, and intellectual engagement from a world now inaccessible. These memories were sustenance. They preserved continuity of self and provided an inner landscape where the soul remained unconfined. Imagination extended these spaces, enabling rehearsal of future lectures, acts of kindness, and reflections on justice. Inner freedom, cultivated in thought, imagination, and attention, proved inviolable. Observation of fellow prisoners revealed profound truths. Some succumbed to despair, bitterness, or cruelty, amplifying their suffering. Others preserved dignity, humor, and ethical engagement despite extreme deprivation. I realized that meaning, deliberately constructed and defended, is the decisive factor between spiritual survival and collapse. Freedom, inseparable from moral and conscious choice, persists even in conditions designed to obliterate it. Interactions with guards, though fraught with danger, offered subtle lessons in autonomy. Compliance could be outwardly necessary, yet internal surrender was optional. I discovered that one could maintain composure, refuse hatred, and exercise patience as a form of invisible resistance. Each decision, however subtle, affirmed moral and psychological sovereignty. Even under arbitrary cruelty, the capacity to choose one's response remains a realm of inviolable freedom. Hunger and exhaustion demanded strategies of mental and moral conservation. One had to allocate attention with precision, directing it toward survival, ethical action, memory, and imagination. Wasted attention could accelerate despair, whereas deliberate focus reinforced resilience. The mind, when disciplined, functions as a bastion of freedom, preserving moral integrity and identity even when the body suffers. Friendship, though rare, became a profound source of sustenance. Sharing food, warmth, encouragement, or simply a glance of solidarity carried immense significance. These interactions were not merely supportive. They preserved humanity itself. Even ephemeral alliances affirmed that ethical life can exist in extreme adversity, and that moral bonds provide resilience against dehumanization. Humor emerged as a subtle yet essential tool of psychological survival. Shared laughter, whispered jokes, or ironic observations created a buffer against despair. Humor reframed suffering, asserting presence and identity. These moments, though fleeting, reinforced resilience and reminded us that the human spirit can assert itself through attention, imagination, and moral engagement, even when the body is confined. Ritual and repetition provided coherence amid chaos. Mental prayers, silent affirmations of ethical intention, and rehearsed sequences of thought created scaffolds of identity. These practices preserved continuity of self, asserting freedom over the inner world, even as the external world imposed relentless suffering. Deliberate cultivation of these internal domains became a profound act of moral and psychological autonomy. I observed the fragility of hope, yet its potency as a sustaining force. Hope is not mere expectation, but a deliberate orientation of consciousness toward possibility. It manifests in attention to ethical action, preservation of dignity, and engagement in moral reflection. Hope must be maintained vigilantly. It is fragile but powerful, capable of sustaining life even when material conditions are dire. The paradox of suffering became increasingly evident. It exposes the essence of human nature. Stripped of pretense, social position, and material comfort, individuals reveal courage, cruelty, compassion, or surrender. External circumstances do not fully define the human spirit. Conscious moral choice, reflection, and attention determine the preservation of dignity. Freedom is inseparable from this cultivation of moral and cognitive agency. Observation of ethical collapse offered instructive contrasts. Those who succumbed to despair or hatred accelerated their suffering, while those who cultivated attention, imagination, and moral practice endured. Meaning, deliberately claimed, becomes the decisive factor in survival. Even minimal acts, a shared morsel, whispered encouragement, maintained composure, affirmed freedom and dignity. Memory and imagination were not only tools of survival but instruments of liberation. I reconstructed past experiences, envisioned future actions, and rehearsed ethical decisions. These exercises created a domain of inner freedom, immune to external control. The deliberate cultivation of thought, attention, and moral engagement ensured that the soul retained sovereignty, even as the body endured relentless deprivation. Interactions with fellow prisoners offered continuous lessons. The fragile alliances, moments of solidarity, and shared acts of kindness revealed that moral life can persist even in extremity. Every gesture of generosity or attention, however small, functioned as resistance against the dehumanizing machinery of the camp. These ethical acts, though invisible to authority, carried eternal significance within the moral domain of the individual. The capacity to endure suffering while preserving dignity depends on deliberate cultivation of mental, moral, and spiritual faculties. Observation, memory, imagination, ethical practice, humor, and ritual collectively reinforce inner freedom. These practices preserve identity and integrity, demonstrating that the human spirit remains sovereign, even under conditions designed to obliterate it. Through these cumulative experiences, I learned that suffering is inseparable from the discovery of freedom. Only when all external liberties are stripped away does the capacity for moral and existential choice become fully evident. Every deliberate thought, every ethical gesture, every act of attention and reflection affirms the irreducible freedom of the human spirit. This insight became a guiding principle, illuminating the path through adversity and the terrain of human resilience. The days in the camp stretched endlessly, each indistinguishable from the last. Yet within this apparent monotony, I discovered a rhythm of existence governed not by the guards or labor, but by the careful cultivation of consciousness. I observed the way prisoners moved, the subtle signs of despair or resilience, the gestures that preserved dignity. These observations were not mere survival tactics. They were exercises in ethical attention. One could not control the cruelty imposed by others, but one could control the response. Each conscious decision to act morally, to preserve dignity, to offer kindness, became a claim to freedom. Even the smallest gestures carried extraordinary significance. I recall a moment when a prisoner, weakened by hunger, attempted to share the last scrap of his ration with another. The exchange was so brief it could have been overlooked, yet it affirmed the existence of a moral universe within the camp, impervious to the machinery of oppression. Acts of compassion, though invisible to authority, reinforced inner sovereignty. They were proof that the human spirit could assert itself in even the harshest conditions. Memory became an indispensable refuge. I would reconstruct scenes of ordinary life outside the camp. Laughter with friends, walks through familiar streets, the warmth of a sunlit morning. These recollections were not indulgent. They were essential. They preserved identity and continuity, providing a mental landscape untouched by oppression. Imagination extended these landscapes, allowing rehearsal of future acts of justice, reflection, and ethical engagement. Inner freedom, cultivated in thought and memory, remained inviolable. Observation of human behavior under extreme conditions revealed profound truths. Some surrendered to despair, bitterness, or cruelty, accelerating their decline. Others preserved rituals, humor, ethical practice, and attentiveness, demonstrating extraordinary resilience. I came to understand that meaning is not incidental. It is the decisive factor in survival. Freedom, inseparable from moral and cognitive choice, persists even in the absence of external liberties. Interactions with guards became subtle exercises in autonomy. Compliance with orders was often necessary, but internal surrender was optional. Maintaining composure, refusing to hate, and exercising patience constituted invisible resistance. Each conscious decision, however minor, affirmed moral and psychological sovereignty. Even under arbitrary cruelty, the capacity to choose one's response represents a domain of freedom no external force can seize. Hunger and exhaustion demanded the careful allocation of attention. One could not afford to waste mental energy on bitterness, envy, or imagined grievances. Attention had to be directed towards survival, ethical action, memory, and imagination. The mind, when disciplined, becomes a bastion of freedom, capable of preserving moral integrity and identity, even as the body suffers. Friendship, though rare, emerged as a profound source of strength. Acts of solidarity, sharing food, offering warmth, whispering encouragement, carried immense moral weight. These interactions affirm that ethical life persists even under extreme adversity. Even ephemeral alliances provided resilience against the forces of dehumanization, demonstrating that the exercise of attention and ethical judgment preserves freedom. Humor, faint and fleeting, served as an essential tool of psychological survival. Shared laughter, whispered irony, or private internal jokes created mental spaces where the self could assert presence. Humor did not erase suffering, it reframed it, reinforcing identity and sustaining resilience. These subtle acts of expression allowed the human spirit to assert itself, even when the body was confined. Ritual and repetition created coherence amid chaos. Mental prayers, affirmations of ethical intention, and rehearsed sequences of thought preserved continuity of self. These practices, invisible to the oppressors, fortified the inner life and asserted freedom over the mind. Even when the body endured relentless suffering, deliberate cultivation of these internal practices became a profound assertion of moral and psychological autonomy. Observation of despair and collapse was instructive. Those who surrendered to hatred or hopelessness accelerated their decline, whereas those who cultivated attention, imagination, and moral discipline endured. Meaning, deliberately constructed and defended, becomes the decisive factor in spiritual survival. Even minimal ethical gestures, offering bread, whispering encouragement, maintaining composure, affirm freedom, dignity, and moral integrity. Memory and imagination were instruments of liberation. Reconstructing past experiences, envisioning future actions, and rehearsing ethical decisions created inner domains of freedom inaccessible to external control. The deliberate cultivation of thought, attention, and moral engagement ensured that the soul remained sovereign, even as the body endured relentless deprivation. Interpersonal dynamics among prisoners offered continuous lessons. Fragile alliances, moments of solidarity, and shared acts of kindness revealed that ethical life could persist even under extreme adversity. Every gesture of generosity or attention, however small, functioned as a subtle resistance against dehumanization. These acts, though invisible to authority, held enduring moral significance. Endurance depended on the deliberate cultivation of mental, moral, and spiritual faculties. Observation, memory, imagination, ethical practice, humor, and ritual collectively reinforced inner freedom. These practices preserved identity, integrity, and resilience, demonstrating that the human spirit remains sovereign even under conditions designed to annihilate it. Through these experiences, I learned that suffering reveals the essence of freedom. Only when all external liberties are stripped away does the capacity for moral, psychological, and existential choice become fully evident. Every conscious thought, every ethical gesture, every deliberate act of attention and reflection is a declaration of freedom. The soul's sovereignty, exercised even amid extreme adversity, becomes the ultimate testament to human dignity and the power of meaning. As the days blurred into one another, and the relentless machinery of the camp sought to reduce us to mere shadows of humanity, a profound realization crystallized within me. Suffering, in its most extreme form, is not merely an ordeal to endure. Is the gateway to freedom. The deprivation of every external liberty, the stripping away of comfort, dignity, and even bodily security, revealed a singular truth. The last dominion that cannot be taken from us is the inner life, the conscious realm of choice, reflection, and moral engagement. I remember standing amidst the barracks, watching a young man trembling under the weight of exhaustion, his eyes hollowed by hunger and fear. I offered him a piece of bread, the smallest fraction of my ration, and as he accepted it, a spark of humanity flickered between us. In that fleeting moment, I understood that the essence of freedom lies not in possessions or physical power, but in the deliberate exercise of moral choice. Even when the world seeks to annihilate the body, the spirit retains the power to act ethically, to preserve dignity, to affirm life. Suffering forced us into the raw confrontation with existence itself. Stripped of pretense and illusion, we face the fundamental questions. Who am I when all else is gone? What remains when wealth, status, and comfort vanish? How do I choose to respond when every external freedom is denied? In these moments, the human spirit reveals its astonishing capacity to endure, to reflect, to act with conscience, and to preserve moral autonomy. Freedom is not the absence of constraint. It is the capacity to choose one's response, even when the world seeks to dictate every action. Memory became a lifeline, a refuge, and a domain of freedom. I reconstructed conversations, rehearsed lectures, imagined acts of justice, and recalled moments of love and beauty from a world that seemed impossibly distant. These recollections were not escapism. They were assertions of sovereignty. In imagination, the mind remained unbound. In reflection, the conscience preserved integrity. In these deliberate exercises of attention, we found the paradoxical liberation of captivity. The body confined, yet the spirit boundless. Even the interactions with those around us, fragile and perilous as they were, became lessons in moral courage. Every act of kindness, sharing food, offering warmth, whispering encouragement, was a rebellion against dehumanization. Every instance of humor, subtle and fleeting, was a declaration of life. Every decision to maintain composure in the face of insults or cruelty preserved a fragment of freedom no external power could touch. These acts, however invisible to the world, carried eternal significance within the moral universe of the self. The guards, embodiments of arbitrary authority, unwittingly taught the limits of external power. Their cruelty could wound, exhaust, and intimidate, but it could not reach the sovereign domain of consciousness. In response to oppression, one could cultivate patience, moral clarity, and deliberate thought. Compliance could be external. Surrender was optional. The space between stimulus and response became the terrain of freedom, the final citadel of human autonomy. Suffering, then, revealed not only the fragility of the body but the resilience of the soul. Those who surrendered to despair, bitterness, or hatred accelerated their decline, while those who cultivated attention, imagination, ethical practice, humor, and ritual endured. Meaning, deliberately constructed and fiercely defended, became the decisive factor in survival. It was not merely a question of existing. It was a question of living consciously, morally, and with dignity. I realized that freedom is inseparable from responsibility. Every thought, every act, every deliberate focus of attention is a moral choice. To preserve integrity in thought and deed is to exercise sovereignty over oneself. Even under the harshest conditions, when every external liberty is stripped away, the soul retains the power to choose, to reflect, to act ethically, and to affirm life. This is the ultimate revelation of suffering. It is simultaneously the crucible of despair and the threshold of liberation. In the quietest moments, when exhaustion pressed upon the body and the world seemed unbearably cruel, I would close my eyes and witness the truth. Suffering is the only path to true freedom, for it is only when everything external is denied that the inner life, attention, conscience, imagination, ethical engagement, emerges in full sovereignty. The human spirit, exercised deliberately, becomes inviolable. The capacity to respond with courage, to act with conscience, to preserve dignity, and to cultivate meaning is the essence of freedom itself. And so, as I stood amidst the shadows of despair, watching the fragile dance of life persist in the eyes of my fellow prisoners, I understood the final lesson of the camp. Liberation is not granted by circumstance, power, or fortune. It is claimed in the mind, exercised in the heart, and enacted in the quiet, deliberate choices that preserve dignity and meaning. Suffering does not merely test us, it teaches us. It unveils the boundless potential of the human spirit, revealing that the last bastion of freedom is ours alone, untouchable, eternal, and luminous beyond measure. Even when the body trembles, when hunger gnaws at the soul, when oppression presses upon every visible freedom, the inner life remains sovereign. To live consciously, to act ethically, to cultivate imagination, to preserve memory, and to choose meaning, this is the freedom that suffering unveils. It is a freedom that cannot be stolen, a light that cannot be extinguished, a testament to the resilience, dignity, and indomitable power of the human spirit. In that realization, I found not despair, but profound hope. The hope that every conscious act, every ethical choice, every deliberate attention to life affirms freedom. That suffering, in its most extreme form, is not the annihilation of the self, but the revelation of its ultimate sovereignty. That through suffering we are invited to claim the most profound liberty imaginable, the freedom of the mind, the conscience, and the soul itself.